an agenda of questions, right? It's actually not an agenda of topics, it's an agenda of questions. Because as soon as you start to ask people questions, their mind begins to move a bit differently than if they just see a topic, right? So, for example, my friend, one of my business partners is the CEO for organizations, and at his board meetings, right, you could have the agenda, the financial report. Instead, he puts, how do we attend to the financial health and well-being of our organization? Whole different, I mean, this invites a whole different way of thinking about going over a financial report, just that simple question. And so all of our processes are question-based, right? Open Space has a question at the beginning, World Cafe has a cascade of questions, Circle, you put a question in the center. I find when I'm struggling with patience that if I ask a question, right, often that's going to invite a whole different kind of conversation. And so questions are kind of this inquiry piece, this question piece is at the heart of this work. What can I get curious about? How do I ask a question about it? And then there's the questions themselves. So we're going to talk about that today. And so one of the first things to consider when you're developing your questions is what is the appropriate scope of the question, right? So the Art of Powerful Question says don't ask people a question they don't feel like they have any control over, right? So it's usually not helpful to ask people, how will we get world peace, right? Because, you know, I mean, some of us may have, and we can certainly impact that, but often it's just like, that's just kind of a brain question. It doesn't move me, I don't have a lot of, impact on it, and so you can lose people if you ask them questions that they don't feel like they actually can impact. So go to the appropriate scope of question. That being said, I found in my work that if I go one level up from what I would typically think of as the appropriate scope, it's really helpful. Because we can talk about names, or we can talk about our organization, and often people feel like they can have some impact in that. But if we talk about the system of disability providers or the state, right? Often folks may not feel that they can have direct impact, but they are being impacted by it, right? So for example, I did some work at Ohio State's Multicultural Center, and there were lots of changes happening. Everyone was feeling really just frazzled, not sure what to do, and so we started the cafe with what's trying to change at the university, right? Because people were just thinking about their office. They were so so fixated on what was happening within their organization that they couldn't kind of get out of it. So we started the question with what's trying to shift at the university. Then we went to what's trying to shift in the Multicultural Center. Then we went to what's trying to shift in the youth. Right? And people were able to kind of see that the shifts at the university absolutely were impacting the shifts in their office, but vice versa, like they could see the shifts happening in their office and how that was reflected in the university. So often, like when we have an issue that we want to solve, we get really reductionist in our thinking, right? And so sometimes opening it up one scale is really helpful, right? So just going up. So if I'm working with a city government, I might ask about the state. Right? You know, if I'm working with, if I might ask about, if I'm working with a state office, I might ask about countrywide what's happening, so we can begin to see trends. If I'm working with a particular organization, I might ask about the field that they're in. So they begin to locate themselves in something bigger. It just like begins to open up what we think about. And so that's the point of questions, right? Is to open up. So think about the appropriate scale, what people can impact, and then what we do, just as our practice is, we kind of go one up. If we have a couple of questions, we'll go one up. So think about the appropriate scale. And that's the scope question. The second thing is look at the assumptions in your questions, right? So this is where I'm going to diverge a little from how many of us were taught, which is make your questions neutral. I'm not a neutral person. I'm not working for a neutral world. I have things I want to get done. I have people I'm willing to work with. And so my questions don't pretend to neutrality, because often like you ask a neutral question, but there's something underneath it and people know it's not neutral anyway. And so like ask the question you want to ask, but own your assumptions within that question, right? And so every night at dinner in my family, we say, what good happened in your day and what bad happened in your day. Number of assumptions in there. Some of the good happened, some of the bad happened, right? I don't just say, how was your day?
I mean, like that's an okay question too, but it just moves it a little bit to have a clarifier in there. What good happened in your day? What bad happened in your day? Sometimes I'll ask my kids, how were you kind today? Like, so that's a value that we have. So the assumption is that they did something kind today, and sometimes they say, no, I wasn't. That's fine. That's fine. Sometimes we'll look a little bit like, well, actually, you thanked me after I gave you this. That was pretty kind. You know, so just like cultivating a practice of kindness. People grow in the direction of the questions you ask them, right? So like just keep that in mind. Questions are really powerful. So what you ask about is where people are going to go, right? So if you ask about what's wrong all day long, people are going to tell you what's wrong all day long, right? So I just want to say that quote was not me. That's David Cooperrider out of Appreciative Inquiry. People grow in the direction of the questions you ask them. So make sure the questions you ask them are moving them and growing them in a direction you want to go. A few years ago, we were working with our Board of Regents in our state, which is over all of the colleges and universities. And the chancellor decided that he would like us as a state to go to a university system, which is really controversial because it means giving up identity, which means giving up donors and money and you know, and just like what makes each college unique. Right? But he was determined that's where we were going to go. And so we hosted a conversation with he and the other regents, and we said, what are the barriers we'll meet as we move to one university system, and how will we meet them? Number of assumptions in that question. We were going to meet barriers. We were going to move to a university system. Like, it wasn't like, should we move to a university system? It was like, when we do this, what are the barriers we'll meet? And then how will we meet them? The assumption is we will meet them. And then the other assumption there's how will we meet them, not the chancellor, right? So like there's just any number of assumptions in that question that moved us in a direction. And so I am not suggesting you don't put assumptions in your question. I'm suggesting that you're intentional about it and that you're thinking about where it's moving people. And I would also just say out loud, please don't ask people questions that insult them. I know, or make assumptions that insult people. I know that sounds crazy. I know that sounds crazy. And you're like, well, I wouldn't do that. But I've been in meetings where people will say, like, what excites us about the direction we're going? And like people aren't excited about the direction they're going, right? You know, just like to kind of like, that's just a premature question. Maybe we could get excited about the question we're going, but the assumption that I'm excited kind of makes me mad, right? And especially when you're asking questions around things that are tender, you have to be careful about your assumptions, right? Because you don't want them to insult people. And while people absolutely grow in the direction of the questions you ask them, that doesn't mean you avoid hard questions because you don't want people to get bogged down, right? So there's a little bit of a, you can be appreciative and not gloss over hard things, right? So sometimes it's actually really important that people talk about the hard things before we get into what we're going to do next. So just notice your assumptions, watch your assumptions, have fun with your assumptions. That's one of the reasons that working with other people is really helpful, because you might not even notice the assumptions you've made, right? So it's just worth them saying, oh, well, you kind of like, Tuesday, you said, you know, when I said what's trying to shift at the university, I made an assumption that something was shifting, right? Like they're in all of our questions. That being said, you don't want to make your questions so assumptive that people have no room to move, right? So like if your question is something like, we should really do this, right? You know, like you might have phrased it a little different, but the thing is like, we should really do this, right? Like that doesn't give people real room to move. So don't make your assumptions too prescriptive. They should hopefully move us in a direction, but not constrict us too much. The third thing to think about when you're thinking about questions is construction. This is like the actual words you use as you develop the questions. And that's important, and that takes, for me, that still takes a lot of time. My partner and I were working on a process coming up for an organization that wanted to fundamentally change the conversation in their field. Like they just like, we've had these conversations for 30 years, we need to do something very different. And we worked on that for hours and hours and hours. What are the conversations, what are the questions we could ask that would move people how they've typically thought about this issue, right? And so we just started playing around with words and language and what would work. So the Art of Powerful Questions has a scaling of questions from least powerful to more powerful. So I want to just share that with you because I think it's useful. And down at the bottom, they have yes/no questions. So this is least powerful. These are more powerful. So down at the bottom are yes/no questions. Should we do this? If you ask that question, especially if it's a hot button issue, people will often go like, yep, or nope, and they don't give you any other information. They just either yes or no, and that's what you got. And so sometimes yes or no questions are good, but more often you can often make them more powerful just by. Then if you go up a bit, and this is why I'd encourage you to, excuse me, look at that document, The Art of Powerful Questions, because I might not have this exactly right. But in the next level up, slightly more powerful, but not the most powerful you can get is when, who, and where questions, right? So if you ask those questions, when should we do this? Well, now, I mean, that could be an important question, right? Because you don't want to do it on high holidays, or you don't want to do it when it's not accessible to people. So when can be an important question, but it's not typically, it doesn't engender a lot of conversation. It's not, same with who. Although I will say, sometimes I put who up one more, because often I ask the question, who else, right? So we've gotten our list for who we should invite to the meeting. Who else is important to be here? Who else cares about this issue, right? Those can be really powerful questions that move people into thinking about things they've never thought about before. So who else cares about this issue? Who are we afraid to invite to this conversation? So any of these could be powerful. It's just kind of generally when you're constructing questions, when, who, and where tend to be a little less powerful. Going up a level are what and how. And I would say 95% of my questions are what and how questions. What are we willing to do together now? How will we deliver on this mandate? What does it look like to create a community that is thriving? How can we provide affordable and sustainable health care for everyone in our community? What matters to us? Why? Well, yeah, what's important about, I think when we started that, I think that was the question. So when we did cafes around the country to develop our federal strategic plan on homelessness. It was the first ever federal strategic plan. And so we needed a check-in question that was powerful and got people there. We only had people 2 hours, and we needed to work on a lot of issues. And people were like all the way from folks who were running homelessness services in the federal government to state officials to service providers to folks who were homeless or formerly homeless. Like they were all in the same place. So we needed a question that would ground us there. And our check-in question was, what matters to me about homelessness? Because everyone could answer that question. Right? And it was actually quite powerful because people could talk about like, why did you come to this particular, they could share a little, it's sought multiplicity. People could talk about, well, I'm here as a governor and I particularly care about this because of this, right? Or I'm a person who's homeless right now. So it matters because it's life or death for me. People could answer. So the what or how questions tend to be where I really focus because almost everything I do that is moving people forward is a what or a how. Art of Powerful Questions says that why questions are the most powerful. Now, I was trained as a social worker, and we were taught never to ask why questions. So I was taught that when you ask people a why question, it makes them defensive. So like, why did you wear that scarf? Right? Like you want to that doesn't make you feel super open, I'm assuming. You want to tell me because I like that scarf. Why are you asking? Right? You know what I mean? Or, like when you ask people why questions, they tend to like dig in, right? Rather than like, yeah. Yeah, you tend to get into defend. Right, yeah.
Depending on what's asked.
Yeah. I mean, my experience of people is that when you ask a why question, they almost always tend to justify where they are and not think about where they could be. Now, I think if you have an open group that's really interested in diving deep, you could ask a why question. I just tend to find that whatever the why question is, I can ask it as a what or a how. So we asked, why do you need to be here now? I think was our check-in question. Why? And that's the only time I ever ask why questions is usually as a check-in. Why is it important that I'm here? You know, why? Some people say like, well, we should ask why we're not communicating well. Well, if you want to get a bunch of justification of current behavior, you ask why are we not communicating well, right? What's happening in our communication that we're struggling with, right? How is it that we could communicate better? What is important about the way we're being with each other that we should attend to, right? Like there are just lots of what and how questions, so I just almost never ask a why, but I just feel like I need to tell you the research says why are the most powerful questions. So there you have it. In terms of construction too, I tend to think about like very specific, right? So, and this is kind of silly, but it's like little nitty-gritty things, and you'll come up with your own words, but I tend to use words like smart in my questions, or now, or bold, or today, or hour. And those questions tend to make an okay question more powerful. I could say, what are the strategies we should engage in? What smart strategy should we engage in today? It just has a different, people respond differently. You add the word smart, somehow that makes a discernment in people's heads. Today makes it seem more present or more immediate, right? Doesn't feel like it's so far out there. So I just tend to have kind of words I use. Today, smart, now, bold. Bold is a word, like what? Bold, you know. And then I tend to use our. So often folks want to say like, what's happening in the community? Well, what's happening in our community? Just a little shift, right? Just makes people own it a little bit more. We, our, like those kind of things that make it present. If you ask about children and you just ask about what's going on with children, what's happening with our children, it's just a really different question than what's going on with kids right now. Right now I use deeply is another word I use. Or deep, like what, you know, what deep change could we make together? Rather than what change could we make together? Just like those words, I mean, I feel almost silly teaching that, but it's just like you need to find your own vocabulary of words, and they need to be words you can deliver, right? So a lot of people will deliver questions as metaphors. I do not speak in metaphors. I don't think in metaphors. So if I take you down a path of metaphors, I'm going to lose myself, right? So if we were a ship and we were sailing on the ocean, what would be the waves we'd hit? Like I cannot, but I have other like good hosts who can be like can actually do the metaphor questions beautifully that just take groups places. And so you have to figure out like what your way of question is. Our friend Toka and my friend Phil use a lot of the word wise. That's a word they use all the time. Wise. I do not, maybe it's because I don't want to speculate why I cannot deliver that word, but I cannot deliver that word. I feel silly delivering that word. I'm going to go with smart every time. Right? So they always talk about wise action. And I'm like, I can't do that. If we were being really smart, what would we do? Like, so, but my way of delivery is much just plainer, right? So you have to find your way of delivery and what are your words and what are the words you can deliver well. And how does your personality come into the questions? Because it doesn't actually matter if it's a good question if you can't deliver it. Well, it says here, you know, what are the wise actions we should take? I can't do that. So think about the words that work for you, and it's worth coming up with a bit of a vocabulary. Almost always if I add now to a question, it's going to help the question out. And it just does. I'm not sure why. Or we can say time often does that. So like we just did a strategic plan for 5 years for an organization, and we said, you know, what do we want? What do we need the organization to be in 2020? Right? A couple of things. We could have said, what do we want the organization to be? Need brought an imperative, right? What does the community need the organization to be in 2020? Made it even more powerful, right? So but often I'll just start with a question, which is why I asked you all to write down your question. I'll just start with a question, then I'll just start working it. How would I make that more powerful? What are the words I would use? What do I really want to say? What's deeper? In terms of sequencing questions, and I think about over meetings, there's no magic in this. This just tends to be what we've found about sequencing questions, right? So in most meetings, you're going to have the chance to ask a number of questions. And I would say in our 90-minute to 2-hour meetings, we're probably asking 5 questions, right? So it's not a huge ton. That's the other reason they need to be powerful, is because you're not asking 15 questions, which is the first thing often that people want to do after they find a cafe. They're like, okay, let's do a cafe. We've got 2 hours. And in the first round, we're going to ask these 4 questions. In the second round, we're going to ask these 4 questions. We just encourage you to ask one question at a time. You know, I gave the example of what are the barriers we're going to meet and how will we meet them. And we needed to put those linked together so that we didn't get a download. But in general, if you can ask one question at a time, that's really good. Because what happens if you ask 2, people tend to answer the easier question. They just do. They just, you know. We had a question last week in an Art of Hosting that was like, what are the gifts I'm bringing? It was a check-in. And the second question was, what were the gifts people need me to bring? And how do we ask those 2 questions together? People would have talked about the gifts they're bringing and talked about the gifts that they needed to bring for about 2 seconds, right? Like people just tend to go to the, you know, just human nature, the questions that seem more accessible. So one question at a time. But as you think about sequencing, we think about it this way. And again, there is no magic to this. This is just what I've tended to find in our meetings. What makes for a satisfying meeting is if we start out the meeting with a personal question that has me speaking from I voice. It doesn't have to be deeply personal. What did you eat for dinner last night? I mean, it could be something like, what are the questions I'm bringing to the meeting today? But just let people start with kind of a personal voice question, then move out to a collective kind of question. You know, so what are the questions I'm bringing to the meeting today? What's important for our agenda, right? Then makes it a we question. We set the agenda. How do we need to be to deliver this? And then what are we going to do? So for me, it's like we start with a personal question. We open up to the collective. It can be a little bit of a being question before we go right into doing. And when I say being, it can be understanding the concept or the landscape. What are we understanding now about hunger in our communities? Right? That's a little bit more of a being question than a doing question before we get to what do we want to do about hunger in our communities. And so just kind of a bit of a me, moving out to the collective we, understanding kind of current context, and then moving into doing, and then finishing up with another personal, the checkout question is always a personal question. What are my next steps? What am I agreeing to do now? What's one thing I'm taking from the meeting? But there's just kind of this movement when you sequence questions from me to our to being to doing to me. See what I mean? Does that make sense? Is that okay?
What's that third word?
This one?
Yeah.
Being, it's kind of a context question. It doesn't have, I mean, it could be how are we going to be together to do it, but it's kind of like what's going on before we move into what we're going to do, right? There's just something about like teasing out a little bit about what's going on before we go to do. And then finish with the me, because then people leave the meeting feeling like they're clear about their own role, or even just that it's closed for them. Sometimes our checkout question is like, what's your favorite dessert, right? Because people just need to seek multiplicity and see each other differently, and it's Friday afternoon, and so I just want to know what you're going to do this weekend, or, you know. But that kind of cascade, me, we, context, doing, and then me again, for me, tends to really satisfy people at meetings. And so I don't say that in any way except that you want people to feel like they've gotten something done, and that the meeting is sealed, and that they're clear, and that they can go on. You know, part of this is just a bit strategic around making sure that people feel good about what you've done so that they come back, so they can do more work together, right? And it doesn't feel like it trickles out.